Everybody, this is Sheritta Bitikofer with Emerging Civil War. I'm here at Andersonville National Historic Site on their Civil War Day to explain a little bit about Andersonville and what happened here between February of 1864 and May of 1865. Poor sanitation, lack of organization of any sanitary measures, overcrowding, poor rations, inadequate medical facilities, and a number of other factors played into the extremely high death rate of Union prisoners here at Andersonville. Between February 25th, 1864 and May 5th of 1865, Andersonville was home to close to 45,000 Union prisoners of war, holding up to 32,000 at its highest capacity. Prisons elsewhere in the Confederacy had become overcrowded after the cessation of prisoner exchange. To alleviate the pressure on existing prisons, the solution was to build more. In December of 1863, Captain Richard B. Winder was appointed as supervisor over the construction of Andersonville. Construction began in January of 1864 and utilized slave labor from the surrounding farms in Sumter County, Georgia. From the start, Winder encountered a multitude of logistical problems. Transportations of supplies was uncertain and incredibly slow. Supplies would need to endure several transfers along the railroad lines due to a lack of standardization in the infrastructure. Lumber mills were uncooperative due to the low budgets afforded by the Confederate government. This meant that, though wood was plentiful, there was no one to process the timber into building materials for the camp. Oftentimes, supplies were simply unavailable or too scarce to allot to Union prisoners when Confederate soldiers were in want of the same supplies. Cooking utensils, medical equipment, and shelters were hard to come by for Andersonville. The stockade was composed of 20-foot logs whose tops would be sharpened to points, then lined in a ditch 5 feet deep. This made the walls around the stockade 15 feet tall. Approximately 100 feet apart stood the sentry towers, where the guards would monitor the prisons inside the stockade. The deadline, a common feature of prison camps, was erected a short distance from the stockade wall to prevent prisoners from approaching the wall with the intent to escape. Guards were ordered to shoot any prisoner who crossed the deadline. On the west wall of the stockade were 2 gates, each with an antechamber where the prisoners would be led upon their arrival to Andersonville. These prisoners came from other camps or were newly captured during the battles of 1864. Prisoners would be divided into detachments of 270, which would be broken down into 3 squads of 90, and further broken down into 3 messes of 30, led by a sergeant that helped to distribute rations and report the sick and dead during roll call each day. Officers were held at Camp Oglethorpe in Macon.
They don't give us anything better.
Sure don't.
When we come through that gate, they shake us down, take all the best stuff.
Yep.
This is what we were left with. We're lucky if we get these blankets. We have to forage for everything else. It's terrible. The water down there, it's already been used up by the Confederates, let's say. They put their camp up there. They use the water for drinking. They also use it for defecating. And all that comes flowing down through us. You can see that creek's not that big. We got to use it for the same purposes too. A lot of us are dying of dysentery, getting sick, up to 100 a day being taken out of here in dead bodies.
A slow-moving creek cut through the center of the stockade, named Stockade Branch. Waste and contaminants flowed downstream from the bakery and cookhouse outside the stockade. A lack of preparation before the prisoners arrived meant that formal latrines were not established. 2 dams were intended to wash out the filth that accumulated in the creek, but their construction was never completed. Stockade Branch would become a breeding ground for illness and disease that rampaged through the camp. Providence Spring, another famous landmark at Andersonville, appeared suddenly one night in August of 1864. This provided prisoners with another source of water apart from Stockade Branch. Accounts differ on how the spring appeared, but it appeared all the same. Prisoner John McElroy wrote, "The camp was astonished beyond measure to discover that a large, bold spring had burst out about midway between the swamp and the summit of the hill. It poured out its grateful flood of pure, sweet water in apparently exhaustless quantity. To many who looked in wonder upon it, it seemed as truly a heaven-wrought miracle as when Moses' enchanted rod smote the parched earth in Sinai's desert waste.
Again, food is, scarce. We are getting about 10,000 pounds of food per day, or the commandant is, but when our numbers are growing so quickly, it doesn't really stretch very far. And aside from the cornmeal, we do occasionally get some meat, but usually it's rancid. So,
Shoot, some days we don't even get food.
Rations were insufficient and often uncooked due to the shortage of cooking equipment for the camp. The soldiers were left to cook the rations themselves or eat them raw, which caused further digestive problems. Sutlers were permitted into the camp to sell their goods at inflated prices to the soldiers who brought money from the outside. Though trading with guards was prohibited, it still occurred within the stockade. Soldiers did all they could to keep their spirits up while inside the prison. Many talked of home and loved ones, while others made every effort to keep themselves occupied. Soldiers were permitted to work outside the stockade, either burying the dead, working in the hospital or cookhouse, or collecting firewood.
I think about home an awful lot. Just trying to stay positive and think the best we could do. Try to pass the time. Some of us might have instruments, some of us might have a game or two, but not much. It's an awful lot of just trying to survive. I'm just trying to make it 1 minute to the next.
write letters too. They do let us send and receive mail, although sometimes it takes a while to get there, and we might not get our mail, whether it's letters or packages, because if it's packages, the guards are going to go through it and make sure there's no contraband. So we might not get the whole package when it comes in.
Newspapers and reading material were highly sought after. The soldiers hungered for any news of the war, hoping each day for an exchange. Many wrote letters home, though all correspondence to and from the camp was closely monitored. Others wrote diaries and journals, providing valuable insights into life inside the camp.
We have to watch out for the Raiders too, because they will steal anything they can get their hands on, and sometimes even kill, like you said, some of our fellow prisoners.
One's from the Navy, one's cavalry, another one's artillery. Can't remember myself, but there's 5 ringleaders or so. Just a bunch of teamsters beating us up, taking all the best stuff. This place is hell enough, but it's even worse when your own brothers in arms are fighting you.
Another infamous aspect of Andersonville was the Andersonville Raiders. They were several groups of men who formed gangs to harass their fellow inmates. They stole rations and other valuables and committed acts of violence, up to murder. Captain Henry Wurtz, commandant of the stockade, permitted the prisoners to exact justice on the raiders, and 6 of their leaders were executed. The medical facilities in the camp were not much better than in the stockade. Overcrowding and too few doctors led to worsening conditions of the patients. Most prisoners died of dysentery due to the poor food and sanitation, overcrowding, and exposure. Prisoners attempted to escape, and many succeeded. Some tried to dig tunnels under the stockade wall, while others waited to be put on wood foraging duty to seize the opportunity to run. Women from Andersonville and nearby Americus did bring relief to the Union prisoners.
So we're out here talking about the role of women at Andersonville. So during the Civil War, lots of women's groups helped, not just at Andersonville, but at Civil War prisons all over. Bringing food in, for prisoners. So they definitely did that, especially from Americus and the surrounding area. Lots of women groups would bring in bread as much as they could possibly do. And of course, this area, very, struggling by itself, civilian-wise. But they really did. They tried to help, of course. So one of them in particular, her name was Mary Rawson, and she came here. Now she found out that her brother now was a Confederate soldier, that he had gotten captured, and he was sent to a Union prison, and so when she found out that there was a prisoner whose family lived near the prison that her brother was in, she got permission from the commandant here, and she came every 2 weeks and wrote a letter to his family, the prisoner here, his family. So they had made a deal that, I'll take care of your son here, and you take care of my brother up in the Union prison, and that's what they did all the way throughout the rest of the war. Both men survived their time in captivity. So definitely, Mary Rawson. was her name. So
Oh,
I think that sometimes they're a little bit overlooked that way. They did, they did such a great job of preserving the site. So it's definitely something that we want to talk about, more and more going into the future here. So, then in the late 1890s, the Women's Relief Corps ends up getting the land from the Grand Army of the Republic. And so they end up helping to set up the monuments that you see out here, just helping, with veterans groups trying to memorialize what happened. They plant a lot of the trees and just kind of take care of the place, make improvements over time until around 1910, 1911, when they give it back to the veterans group. So they did a lot to preserve the site. Most of the buildings they originally helped build, and just especially the lodge in the cemetery to give veterans a place to come and reflect and stay and be peaceful when they came to see it. So
Priests and chaplains frequented the camp, the most famous of which was Father Whalen.
Father Peter Whelan was an Irish-born Catholic priest, came to this country in the 1820s at the invitation of Bishop John England from Charleston, South Carolina, and he studied to become a priest and was ordained in 1831. He was actually an unofficial chaplain to the Montgomery Guards who were at Fort Pulaski, and when the fort fell, he went with the men to Governor's Island. He was given a lot of free rein. Apparently he could go in and out of New York City and talk to the Catholics there to get food, clothing, whatever other necessities they could give to help out the enlisted prisoners who were there. The officers from Fort Pulaski realized that his suit of clothes was getting pretty ragged. And so they made arrangements to have a new suit made for him. They carefully placed it next to his bed while he slept. And when he woke up the next morning, they did say he exhibited just a little pride in having that new suit of clothes. But it wasn't a few days later, they noticed he was back in his old clothes. And they asked him, well, Father, what happened to the new suit? And he said, well, there was a prisoner here that was captured while swimming in his underwear, so I gave him the new suit. They said, well, why didn't you give him the old suit? Keep the new one. And he said, when I give for Christ, I give the best. There. So he knew what these guys were going through. And he gets here on June the 16th, 1864, and he doesn't leave until about the 1st of October. In January of 1865, he borrowed $16,000 in Confederate money from a restaurant owner in Macon, a man named Mr. Horn, and with Commandant Wurtz's permission, bought flour and had it baked into bread specifically for the prisoners. It wasn't to be given to the guards. And Wurtz honored that. And it became known as Whalen's bread. He contracted a lung ailment while he was here, probably tuberculosis. And the people of his church took up a collection to send him north. They thought the colder climate would be much better for his lungs than the humidity of Savannah. And instead of using that to move north, he basically signed his own death warrant and used that money to pay back Mr. Horn what he owed him. He died in 1871 from the same lung ailment, and his funeral was one of the largest ever seen in Savannah. The prisoners who were here that wrote about him, they didn't often name him, but they said that he was the only man of the cloth that came and stayed so long in our presence. And he would minister to Catholics and Protestants alike, and he was well sought after by all the prisoners who were here. That was it. Now, he did spend a lot of time in the hospital. Either of the two. One was down in the far southeast corner, and then it was moved almost due south of the prison. And he would go in because he knew those were the most critically ill, and those were the ones who needed last rites the most. So he went in to minister to them.
By the end of September in 1864, most prisoners and guards had been evacuated from Andersonville as federal forces were making plans to move further south after the capture of Atlanta. By May 5, 1865, all prisoners from Andersonville were paroled. The final death toll reached nearly 13,000.
So a prisoner named Lawrence Atwater, he kept the one of the clerks working as guys are dying. He works in the burial registry. He's not the only one that kept an account, but he definitely did. Is most famous for that. Keeping a secret list, which he snuck out of here. He was afraid the Confederates are going to destroy the records after the war. They didn't. They're at the National Archives still. But so he keeps a secret list, and he goes up to the government, and there's a little bit of exchange about ownership of the list, but he contacts Clara Barton to help him, get this established. So Clara Barton comes down to Andersonville with Captain Moore to help with the cemetery and contacting families of the men that are buried here. And Clara Barton is actually the first person to raise the American flag after the Civil War in the cemetery, so pretty significant there.
Andersonville gained national notoriety, and Northern newspapers claimed that the Confederate government had systematically set out to kill Union soldiers as retribution.
You're going to have mixed groups of people everywhere, right? So you have good, like we talked about, the women that came to give bread, and then there are some that were not, especially, if your husband, your son or brother, was killed, you might have a harder time.
Andersonville has been made into films and books in the last century, drawing on accounts from prisoners who endured the horrors of the camp. Everyone who hears about its story have their own strong opinions and feelings.
It is a really good example of what happens when two sides decide to stop talking and resort to violence. Tens of thousands of dead, 100 a day, and a scourge in the earth that we have to remember for all time. This is what happens when we stop talking and start seeing each other as the other and not as our countryman, brother, friend, human.
John Henry Winder, superintendent of all Confederate prison camps east of the Mississippi, might have been the most to blame for the mismanagement of Andersonville. However, he died in February of 1865. Captain Henry Wurtz became the main target, charged for inhumane treatment within the stockade itself. He was one of only 2 men to be executed for war crimes following the Civil War. Today, visitors come to Andersonville to learn more about what occurred here during the Civil War, as well as to learn about the experiences of prisoners of war in American history.